Okay, so I think we're set to go. Today, this is my second video, by the way, and in this video I intend to discuss the peculiarity of Christian mythology. And I'll be explaining, not from a point of view of the doctrine per se, but from a purely mythological framework as to why I find Christianity a very appealing collection of myths. Now, prior to discussion, obviously, I think it's vital to describe what myth is. Now, when I use the word myth, I don't typically use it as we often do in our colloquial discourse. So, myth is not simply just something which is a lie or a fabrication or falsehood. Rather, it's a system or a network of stories, rather, by which we try to associate ourselves with one another and to the society at large, and try to locate ourselves in the physical world to make sense of our existence. Let's say that is the way I use the word myth. I often find it so abused, but I think it's also largely because most people do not really concern with the academic literature, and they just take myth as something which there is no evidence for, and therefore it's simply a lie. Anyways, I'll be discussing very briefly, I must say, about the Catholic philosopher and historian Rene Girard, who was from France. When an anthropologist or a sociologist tries to study the religions of the world or myths of the world, he typically avoids making value judgments, right? So the goal of an anthropologist is not to pass judgments about other cultures, but to explain how these cultures behave and what these cultures are. So an anthropologist, by its very definition, is someone who tries to avoid passing value judgments as much as possible. Similar was the case with Girard in the beginning, I would say, but he kind of, when he was looking at different cultures and studying different mythologies, something struck him about the Bible and Christianity, about which he then greatly elaborated. Now, I'm not exactly an expert on Girard because he's rather abstruse to read, but there's something in him that really strikes me. So let's try to understand what those things are. Well, I made notes here. Initially, I thought I could just I could just narrate without notes, but I just feel that notes would be somewhat better way of communicating what I want to say. So before I go into Girard, I just want to say that the definition of what a religion is and what sacred means are somewhat diverse, but I tend to agree with Durkheim's view of religion and sacred, which is that some things which are set apart and forbidden. So there is, and I believe, within human beings a desire to locate certain objects within our physical world and try to elevate them as if they belong to the transcendental realm, right? So the Holy Scriptures, the temples, they are part of the physical world, yet they are also a passage to Creator, to God, and to the transcendental. So, to quote another scholar of religion, Michel, according to him, they are more like, I don't exactly remember the word, but I think he called it like hagiographies or something. I don't quite remember, but you could search on your own. But it's quite difficult to understand the sense of the sacred. So, but typically I would agree with Durkheim's definition of what a sacred is. Sacred is the sort of stuff which is set aside and forbidden, right? Things that we greatly value, as if they may have an otherworldly importance, and in a sense, they kind of our real existence relies on our attachment to these things. So it's not really an irrational kind of thing, as some would like to believe, and Some would say that the more you do science and the more you emphasize on human reason, there might be a world where there is no such a thing. But I don't exactly view it that way. I think you could use the word sacred almost synonymously with the word taboo. And I think this is just a human desire, because even in very secular societies, there are certain, obviously, taboos that still exist, beyond which we do not dare travel. So it's not something I think just... Obviously, I also disagree that the transcendental yearning would somehow disappear once we make sophisticated rockets, or if we just like discover new laws of nature, perhaps. But I just think that these two are very different human urges. The urge to understand the physical world is different from the urge to understand our position in it, our existence as a whole. Anyways, so Girard, when he's talking about Christianity and religion in general, he begins from an observation that I think no impartial reader of the holy text, like whether the Bible or the Quran, would fail to make, which is that the monotheistic religions may claim that they promise peace, but they are also deeply implicated in violence. Passages in the Quran, passages in the Old Testament. The New Testament is quite an improvement, I must say. But it's the Old Testament and Quran is littered with a God who does strike me as a cosmic Saddam Hussein. The God presented in these writings is quite often angry and seldom deserving of the epithets bestowed upon him in the Quran, like Al-Rahman Al-Rahim, which means the all-merciful and all-compassionate. Seems really a contradiction when I read it, but according to, sometimes he also makes outrageous and bloodthirsty demands, such as the demand that Abraham sacrifice his son. This particular demand, which is present in all three religions, and by the way, there was just recently Eid al-Adha, which is a Muslim festival where animals are sacrificed to commemorate the event of Abraham going insane for a while and trying to slaughter his child. Nevertheless, I think this is the crux of the matter, and I'll get to that a bit later, because I think what Girard is saying is important in understanding the peculiarity of Christian myth. So you sacrifice the lamb in the story of the Abraham basically comes across as a scapegoat, right? So God appears to Abraham in his dream and appears to be demanding that he sacrifice his son for the sake of God, and Abraham concedes. Yet at the very last moment, his son gets replaced by a lamb. So you see the lamb is acting as a scapegoat between man and God. And the crux of Christianity really lies in erasing others as scapegoats, but making God himself the scapegoat. And I'll get to that in a brief moment. This story about Abraham, it's present in all the three religions, main religions of the Abrahamic faith, like of the Abrahamic lineage, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And this is what was singled out by Kierkegaard as the ultimate test of faith, to which Abraham must respond by an infinite resignation. Others, by contrast, which include me, perceive the story as something which really contradicts our basic moral intuitions. For Girard, however, the theory has another significance entirely. It illustrates the true rule of religion, not as the cause of violence, but as the solution to it, even if the solution must take the form, as here, of a sacrificial offering. According to Girard, violence is not something that comes from religion, but it is engendered by the very attempt of human beings to live together as individuals rather than as members of a pack or hurt. So the violence itself comes from another source, but religion is something which is trying to solve the problem. So religion is not the cause of the violence, but as the solution to it, even if the solution does take the form of violence or sacrificial offering. According to Girard, the primeval condition of society is one of conflict. It is in the effort to resolve this conflict that the experience of the sacred is born. Now, this experience comes to us in many different forms, in religious ritual, in prayer, in tragedy. But its true origin is in an act of communal violence. Primitive societies emerge from the state of nature and the bondage of animal life only to be invaded by mimetic desire. Mimetic desire is something like desiring what other person has and you don't have. According to Girard, we want something often it's not because we truly want it, but because other person has it, right? That was his theory. In very crude terms, as I said, I'm not an expert on Girard, but in very crude terms, that was what was his mimetic theory. And I must confess, I don't agree with everything he says. Like I'm naturally very, very leery of psychologists, whether they be or anyone who tries to give a complete description of what anything is. I think it's just somewhat difficult to grasp the sacred, the religion, or human nature in a single theory of any kind. Anyways, according to Girard, primitive societies emerge from the state of nature and the bondage of animal life only to be invaded by mimetic desire, as people struggle to match each other's social and material accusations, which is precisely what I described, which increases antagonism and precipitates a cycle of revenge. The solution to this kind of violence is to identify a victim, one marked by fate as outside the community and therefore not entitled to vengeance against it, who can be the target of the accumulated bloodlust and who can bring the chain of retribution to an end. Scapegoating is society's way of recreating difference and so restoring itself by uniting against. I'm being a little on the charge. I'm somewhat accelerating because I can't really make a video longer than 25 minutes. By uniting against the scapegoat, people are released from their rivalries and reconcile. Through his death, the victim purges society of its violence. His resulting sanctity is the long-term echo of the awe, relief, and visceral reattachment to the community that was experienced at his death. The victim is thus both sacrificed and sanctified. The source of the city's plague and their cure. The experience of the sacred is not, on this view, an irrational desire which exists due to some primitive fears, nor is it a form of superstition that will one day vanish once we have perfected our scientific knowledge. According to Girard, it is a solution to the accumulated aggression that lies in the heart of human communities. However, it is a solution that in its original version places violence in the heart of things. Now, before I get to the Christianity here, I must confess that I don't particularly agree with Girard on this point. I think the core of religion is not really, the core of sacred is not really communal violence. And again here the problem is what it was before, that people really take one aspect of religion and sacred, and then they try to describe the entirety of it from that point of view. I mean, someone is outside, I'm just trying to look. So I don't particularly agree with Girard, because I think there are other parts of religion like sexual union, marriage, death, many other communal gatherings like in prayer in the church, where really we're not discussing any kind of sacrifice or violence, but simply trying to reach out to the transcendental. So even though it is somewhat incomplete account of what sacred is, it is nevertheless still important. In a singular argument, Girard suggests that Jesus was the first scapegoat to understand the need for his own death and to forgive those who inflicted it. Now I'm getting to the point of the Christian peculiarity. And in submitting to this, Girard argues Jesus gave the best evidence and perhaps the only possible evidence of his divine nature. He was the Lamb of God, the innocent victim, and also Emmanuel, God, who lives amongst us, who came to release us from the violence that had up until that point been locked into the heart of our communities. On him all the sins of the world, sins of envy, rivalry, and malice could be discharged, and he would accept the death that these states of mind are inwardly longing for. This mystical idea is celebrated in the Christian Eucharist when the Christians rehearse the sacrifice of God who took their sins upon himself and so purchased their forgiveness. Now, as I said, this is somewhat incomplete account of what sacred is. There are other accounts, certainly, but it is still quite an important one. I tend to think that the sense of the sacred precedes sacrificial offering or ritual sacrifice, and it is more fundamental to the human condition. But this does not mean that the genealogical account, which is advanced by Girard, it has no importance. In fact, they try to give an account of why there is violence in the scriptures and what it might stand for. Anyways, Girard, much like Hegel, takes himself to be describing the deep features of the human condition, which can be observed as well as in the mystery cults of antiquity, but also in the local shrines of Hinduism and in the everyday rites of the Eucharist. And like Hegel, he wishes to single out the Christian religion for special treatment. The Christian sacraments rehearse the solution that previous explorations of the sacred could not find, which is the self-sacrifice of God. And this is, in my view, the peculiarity of Christianity, in a sense. Because the story of the crucifixion, what it tells us is that God is taking upon the sins on himself rather than encouraging people to make a scapegoat, a lamb perhaps, or another tribe or another human being, and in order to seek forgiveness. Rather, it's God himself taking the responsibility for our sins. And that is quite an important point, a point which I think is not entirely accepted or entirely acknowledged, or I don't know how to put it, entirely understood, let's say, by many people. And the notion of self-sacrifice, making yourself the victim rather than victimizing others, is profoundly a Christian idea. And it is so important, because when you look at some of the social movements that have emerged in the West, they have been of good causes. They have been thoroughly Christian. Let's say the movement for racial equality in the U.S. is profoundly Christian, spearheaded by someone like Martin Luther King Jr. But the point is, what was so different in the discourse of Martin Luther King or Desmond Tutu was precisely that if you want to make a change, you don't go on and start spreading hate against white people or other communities. Rather, it is only through self-sacrifice that you can really bring about any everlasting change. And it is precisely that vision, I think, that has that kind of, when the black majority got to power in South Africa, prevented them from just going crazy and murdering the white people who, honestly, not all of them certainly, but part of them who discriminated against them for at least a century or so. But the vision of Christ was very important, and the story of crucifixion was very important, which was that even if we are persecuted, even if we are discriminated, it is only through our own sacrifices, through our own through our own how to put it, let's say, it is through more peaceful ways that change would come. And this is the reason why someone even like Gandhi was quite impressed by Christianity, and particularly by, Tolstoy was also impressed by Christian pacifism, which is precisely the idea that if a change, an everlasting change, has to come, it has to come through self-sacrifice and not through asking others to donate or spill their blood. And if you compare Christian-inspired movements like the ones which seek to abolish slavery, or sought to abolish slavery, or sought to abolish racial discrimination, and you compare those with more atheistic or secular movements, secular is probably a better word, like Bolshevik Revolution or the French Revolution, you'll see precisely that they were of the view that what we have to do is that we have to sacrifice not ourselves but others. So the class, if you're a Bolshevik, then the bourgeoisie is the culprit. Just go and behead it and your problems will be solved. If you're a fascist, then the Jews are your enemy. So they are the scapegoats. It's only Christianity where the scapegoating idea has been somewhat minimized. And it has been minimized because it says that one ought not to look for scapegoats, rather bring the change through self-introspection and self-sacrifice. And that's a very important message, and I think worth preserving if we are to save ourselves from some other radical ideas and other radical movements. Anyways, to end, I'll just say, which is a very important point in my view, and it is this, that when we look at all the religions of the world, we tend to think that they're all the same, but in my view they're not the same. There is the greatest difference in the religion between religions that demand self-sacrifice and those of the Aztecs or other antiquity that demand the sacrifice of others. And if there is anything that could be called progress in religion, it is precisely the idea that it is the self rather than the other as the primary sacrificial victim. And it is precisely in this that the Christian religion rests its moral claim. So that's how I would describe it. By the way, if any of you would like to know more deeply about this issue, because I'm not quite an expert, as I said, I recommend reading Soul of the World by Roger Scruton, where Roger Scruton also explains Girard and describes some of his contributions and also disagreements. If you want a full account, you can read that there. So the point is that I'm not here justifying Christianity as like a true religion or something. What I'm saying is, what are most of our moral suppositions, which give individual some kind of priority over the collective. Well, I haven't really explained that, but maybe in some other point I will do that. But the idea of self-sacrifice and bringing change through your own introspection rather than through your own sacrifice and through your own victimhood rather than sacrificing others is a profoundly Christian idea and has had very deep influence on us. And I would say that the reason why we tend to have less violence in the West is that we have become accustomed to the idea of viewing wars as somewhat unnecessary or wrong, is precisely because we do not subscribe to the idea of killing others or making others the scapegoat for our progress. And if you remove that, which we did in the 20th century, we knew the consequences of that.